So in this video, we're going to attempt to give you an intro into batch effects, and predominantly batch effects on the timeline, on a segment as it exists in an editorial context. And I can tell you now that we're not going to squeeze in all the features of batch into one video. So this, once again, is just like an overview. It's a taster, give you an idea of the mechanism, how it actually works, and how you could start exploiting it to start doing creative work inside of your editorial timeline. And it kind of keeps it all nicely intact. Now, I've added a few more clips to this edit that we were doing with the boats. As you can see at the bottom, it's still basically the edit that we're playing around. We've got a bit of green screen down the bottom. We're going to be playing with that later on. But I've also added an extra layer with a clip above another clip. Now, this is just to sort of highlight that you can actually do compositing layer based, so something like you might do in After Effects or Premiere or those other applications, anything where you're stacking up layers and cutting through layers to see layers below. Layer based compositing. The name speaks volumes. Now, if we actually select this clip for a second and we add a 2D transform into this and we start to scale and manipulate this down, probably something that you wouldn't expect to happen is going to happen, is that even though this is a layer above another layer, and if we make that bottom layer the primary track, you can see that something is still there. Why can't I see that layer when I start manipulating a picture-in-picture effect on top of that? Well, that's because at the end of every segment's pipeline, on the editorial desktop in our sequence, you've got a node that's called comp, and by default this is off. Now, if you want to start using layers as a compositing tool, if we come into here and we kind of switch the comp node on, you can see that now we can see the result of our scaling down of this image, and we can see our background through it, which is kind of good. It also gives us access to things like transparency and blend modes that we can use, as well as if we're working with mattes, pre-multiplication and division on here as well. So all very good. And for a lot of things, you can get away with that. You can start building effects layers with text on there. You can start stacking things up. But when you start either wanting to get creative or you've got a lot of elements to wrangle, sometimes working in a layer-based environment is not the best solution. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn the comp node off. We're going to remove our transform for a second, and we're going to see what kind of alternatives we've got instead. And to really sort of explain it a little bit better, let's just take this single layer, this sort of buoy at the beginning here, as it were. Now, when we go into our effects menu, as I said before, we've got all of our what we classify as timeline effects. These are sort of things that we're going to use quickly that will be used with conforms to interpret metadata from other editing systems. But to the left of this bar, we've got several options all related to creating a batch effect. So just to kick this off, we're not going to worry too much about all these because they will become a little bit more obvious when we work on some other clips. But if we just create a batch effect on that buoy and see actually what happens. So this is what the result is in the interface, is that it takes us inside of a node graph. Now, navigation wise, there's a couple of things that you're going to need to know straight off the bat to make your life easier. So first of all, we got the opportunity to kind of split this down into several viewports. Otherwise, we're going to be constantly toggling in and out. And for the purposes of showing you how this works, that could get a little bit confusing and a little bit sort of like flashy on the screen. So down here, we're going to split up our interface into what we call a 2-up view. Now, once again, we've got the same space bar at pans and control space to zoom. But essentially now what we can do is we can look at our schematic in one viewport, and we can look at our result or any of the results of the tools that we're going to apply inside. So what does this schematic really kind of mean? Well, it means that from the timeline, because we are still in the timeline, this is the source footage that we applied the batch effect to. And in between effectively the input and returning us back to the timeline, which is this batch effects node, we can place really anything we want from the tool bin down the bottom of the interface. So the tools down here are organized in several ways. We can see all of the nodes. We can also configure and make custom bins, whether it's user or project based. We can see some special nodes. So we've got a separate bin that contains all of our Matchbox or GLSL accelerated effects. So there's a whole raft that ship with the actual application, and there's some third-party ones which are all open source. You should check out. It's the Logic Matchbox group. You can download a whole bunch of effects, and you can use those in here as well. We've also then got them categorized into color correction, keying, compositing tools, effects tools, and formatting tools. And once again, up here, if you hit the plus, you can actually make your own custom bins and save your favorite tools in them. If you want to kind of look and search for a particular tool in the node bin down here, because there are quite a lot of them, there's some hotkeys once again which you can utilize to save yourself a lot of trouble. So for argument's sake, if I wanted to find a particular effect that begins with S, if I hover my cursor over this area and hit S on the key, it will highlight and move me to show me all of those tools that start with S. It's fairly simple. Just to get an idea of what the pipeline is doing, we're going to start off sort of fairly simply, so we can kind of work through this, because once again there are some concepts that we need to work out from the offset, so it's not too confusing. So we're going to bring out a color corrector for a second, and we're just going to kind of zoom in a little bit on this so it makes a little bit more of us. Now straight away my image has disappeared from my viewport over here, and this is because batch is pretty contextual. So when I tap on an item, I will see the result of that. Now, because I just dragged this node into the schematic, if I tap on that, it's actually got no input at the moment, so it actually can't display me anything at all. The thing we do have, and depending on the nodes that we're working with, we're going to have multiples, more of these, less of these. But as a rule, we're going to have what we call a front input, a background, and a matte input. So front, background, and matte. And depending on what you want to do, you can populate some of these or all of these inputs to gain the effect that you want. So if you wanted to do a simple color correct on this, and once again, you could do a color correct again on the timeline, which is fine. But if you wanted to do a color correct inside a batch, we need to get this into the pipeline. We need it to get between the original source and the result that is going back to the timeline. Now we can do that in several ways. We can actually grab here and pull out a pipe, and we can hook it in. You can see that when I do that, I can now see the result, or the result that I'm going to have inside of my viewport over here. Now to separate out a pipe, we can do this in several ways, but if you tap down and drag a line through, that will effectively cut off that connector. If we didn't want to connect this into this and then replace the input into there, there's an easy way of doing it, actually replacing or putting a node into an existing pipeline. So let's just undo that a couple of times. We're going to pick up our node, and I'm going to hold down the shift key and drop this in until the connection turns orange. And when I release that, you can see that what it's going to do is it's going to connect up to the front, and then it's going to connect the color correct into the batch result, which feeds me back to the timeline. Now, if you want to remove a pipe, once again, instead of cutting this and then reconnecting, it's going to Control Z and undo that. If we hold down the Alt and the Meta key, or the Windows key, it's going to allow me to take away a node but maintain the pipeline connection. Okay, so Shift adds in, Alt and Meta or Alt and Windows key allows you to take out a node. So let's put our color correction back in for a second, and we want to actually now expose the tools that allow me to do some color correction, something kind of crazy. So once again, if we come to the node that we want to work on, if we double tap on it, that will then bring up in the interface at the bottom the tools tab for that particular tool. And you can see that this is pretty much the same as the color correction tool that we were using at the desktop level, at the timeline level, because it is in fact the same tool. So let's go in and do some crazy kind of color correction. We want this to be quite obvious. So if we come make it extremely sort of blue, you can now see that we have a blue color correction that goes across the entire length of the clip. Basically anything you want to do, but we're going to keep this really simple. Now, once again, we have different ways that we can view hotkeys, that we can actually view different parts of this pipeline or the result of such. By default, we're going to be kind of looking at the result. And if we tap on this, you can see, whoa, there are a lot of options. So once again, a few hotkeys are well worth learning. But if you look at this, you can see we've actually got hotkeys that list the input, so the front, the back, and the matte. And our color correct result is F4. So we've got F1 for front, F2 for back, F3 for matte, F4 for our result. So once again, it's a good idea to at least learn these together with some of those hotkeys that we showed you on the desktop, because sometimes you may want to quickly see where you were. That's F1 for front. You can see down here that this changes to front, and F4 shows me the result. Now, in any kind of procedural tree, node graph, you've got the options to feed in multiple things. And in the color correct, I could actually limit the area that color correct is going to take by putting in a matte input. So if I wanted to draw a mask, or if I wanted to use a key or something like this to limit that color correction, that is where I'll be piping in that input. So once again, we're going to keep this nice and simple. We're going to go back down to our effects nodes, and then we're going to look for some masks. Now, we term our masks inside of Flame and Batch Effects, or Batch, as G masks. So if we hit a G, this is going to bring us to all the things called G. In this particular case, I'm going to use a G mask. We're going to bring that into the pipeline. Now, I need to have a reference to draw my mask. So if I pull out a pipe here, connect it into this, the result is initially I'm just going to see my matte result, which is going to be 100% white. So if I hit F1, it's now going to allow me to see the input that is coming into it. And I can kind of use that to either trace around or decide where my matte is going to be. Once again, if we double tap on this, we're going to see the tools. And initially what we need to do on this particular tool is to add in a new object. So we're going to be drawing a new mask. And we can do that by coming down here and going add geometry. That puts me into a draw mode. And I'm just going to do something really very, very obvious. I'm just going to draw a big wibbly wobbly shape around this and hook it up. So that is my reference. This is kind of what I'm drawing. If I hit F4 again, I'm going to see this. This is going to be the result, my matte output. This is actually what I'm going to be feeding out of the Gmask. So if I take that matte and now feed it into my color correct, and I tap on my color correct, and I look at my result view for a second, you can see that now my color correct is only being affected by the area that I drew in the mask. Okay, the white area is limiting the color correct. And of course from here we can use all the tools inside the mask, to go through and kind of soften this, etc. Now, sometimes you also need to work in context, because you can see that when I tap on this tool, I get to see the softness, but I don't see the effect it's having on my end result here. So once again, we've got lots of contextual menus inside of Batch. You can learn the hotkeys for these, but if we do a meta key or right click on this, we can come down here and we can actually set as a context. And we get up to 10 context views down here, and basically you're locking a particular node or a view to a viewport. So if we set the color correct as context number 1, and we go to this viewport, and in our viewing, we can say view context number 1. Regardless of what tool I now tap on, yes, we get the tools come up, but I'm always fixed on my result view of this particular node, which is quite nice then, because I can come in here, I can see my overlay of my mask, and maybe I could actually make that just a little bit tighter, or actually roto completely around the boy, so we're just affecting that color. When we're kind of happy with our result of what we're working with, then that will feed back into my timeline. And if we exit the batch effects, you can now see that the result of our fruits of our labor, which is really not that hard to be quite honest, now sits very, very obviously on the clip. So this is really, really simplistic stuff. But the nice thing about it is that, this is a live effect. So, on the batch effect, we can go back into that editor and we can say, well, actually, we really do need to tighten that up. Or maybe we needed to add another effect in there. Or maybe we need to sort of come through and kind of change the color correct and actually start to really sort of saturate out that particular area. Okay, so it's a flexible way of working that's node based instead of layer based. Now, like I said, this is very, very simplistic, but it's got us through a couple of things to start with. We know how to add nodes in, we know about the inputs, we know about fixing a result, and we also know about how we can view that in context, and that this feeds back into my timeline. Now, batch effects are pretty much like any other effect, by as much as that we can copy that to any other segment. The other thing that we haven't touched upon yet either is that we can actually copy these effects, whether it's a timeline effect or a batch effect, and we can actually pick that up and we can drag it out to a reel as a setup. And you can see, even though we've got like a little thumbnail effect, it's saying that this is a batch effects timeline effect, and we can actually then replicate and drop that onto any other clip in the sequence and replicate that batch effect. To remove a batch effect, we can simply pick it up and we can drag it off or click the remove button, and then it takes everything back to default as it was before we started. Now, the difference comes when we start looking at multiple layers. If you start taking multiple things into batch, you're going to have a lot more options on how you want to take that in. And if you look at this for a second, this particular clip, this clip on the top, we've got a time warp and a resize. The bottom clip, we've also got a time warp and a resize. Now, we could apply just a batch effect to this one clip, which will be exactly the same as what we just did, and we're just taking that effect into batch. But sometimes you want to take multiple clips into batch. You want to sort of say, well, these are all my layers, and I want to actually compound those down and take them all into batch to composite or do an effect or whatever you want to do with them, really. Now, when we do that and we come to the batch effects menu, some stuff over here changes straight away. Because we've selected multiple layers, it's going to take those in as a flow graph. We could take that in as a 3D comp. We can add adjustment segments, that's something different, or we could take this in as a clip. So I'm going to quickly step through these because, coming in new to the system, if you haven't played with this before, some things like this will catch you out, make you scratch your head and go, I don't understand what's happening. So let's look at this as a selection as a flow graph. We're going to create that batch effect. And what happens inside of here is it's going to take everything that was on the timeline. You remember both clips had time warps, both clips had a resize. It's going to put in a default composite node for us already, and then hook that up to the batch effects back into the timeline. So effectively here it's taking everything from the timeline and it's bringing it into batch for us to then start working on. And once again, we can sort of like separate out this. We don't have to use the comp node. We can drop in whatever nodes we want to in that path to create the effect that we want. I'm just going to undo this for a second because we always must have a connection going back to batch effects. We're going to exit batch effects back to the desktop, and we're going to remove and recover the stack. Well, actually, I'm just going to go undo for a second. Now, another option you could do as well, if you anticipate that you're going to be working in 3D, and we're going to be looking at 3D compositing in a completely separate video. We are going to touch on it a little bit here because it's very difficult not to, but we could actually take that selection in as a 3D composite. Now, when we create that batch effect and we go into batch, all this is pretty much the same. We've got some mux nodes here, except now what this is doing is it's taking the result of all that and putting it into an action node. Now, once again, if we split our viewports up for a second into two-up view, I'm not going to labor too long about action inside of here because we're going to do a separate video on it because it is a big topic. But action is in fact a whole nother separate schematic again that allows us to do not only 2D but 3D compositing with spatial effects and tracking and keying. Pretty much this is your creative compositing playground, as it were. Batch is for modifying and putting on effects, but when it comes to big multi-layer composites, we're going to be spending a lot of time in action. But while we're here, just briefly, if we come down to this for a second and we just kind of scale this down, you can see that effectively what we're doing is we're taking these two layers that came in and then we can manipulate those on top of each other. We're going to come back out by hitting escape to our batch schematic. This all feeds back into the timeline and we exit batch effect, and then we have the result of what we were working on. So that's kind of another way of doing it. But sometimes you just literally want to build the composite from scratch. You don't want have to have anything coming in from the timeline into batch. You just literally want to work with the sources. So if we bear that in mind and we select our two clips again and we bring up our effects menu, if we hit our control tab again, we can actually take both of those clips in a mode that's called selection as clip. So if we now create that batch effect, something really strange happens. I only have one clip. That is peculiar. Well, it's not really, because this is a compound clip at this stage. And if we look down in our batch menu section, right at the bottom here, we have a thing called timing. Now, the timing view here gives me kind of like a view of the temporal position of clips inside of batch. Okay, so they've been trimmed, they're coming in from the timeline, but this is how we could slip and slide and in one particular way change the timing or the offsets inside of this effect. But you can see here that it's actually seeing both of those clips come in, and it's actually sort of containered down. We're only going to be seeing the top clip at this stage. You also notice down here that we do have, again, access to the editorial tools as well. So we can actually go through and sort of trim and manipulate these to a certain extent. But this per se is not an editing environment as we're looking at here. This is pretty much just for timing. So I know that both of those clips are in there, and if I want to actually expose those, once again, I can kind of right click on that clip and I can then go through and go split tracks. And what I will get now is both of those clips that I had on the timeline exposed separately inside of batch, and I can now manipulate and do what I want with these. So let's think a little bit more creatively rather than just doing a picture in picture, and let's start using some of the tools and see how they can kind of interact. So first off, I'm just going to draw a line through here. I'm just going to separate these, and I'm thinking what would be kind of nice. Let's get a two-up view as well so we can see what's going on. And I'm just going to make a bit more space. I'm just going to control swipe out so we have a little bit more real estate over here. So I think what would be nice is, for like a creative effect that we're doing, it'd be nice to have maybe the boat sort of coming through the silhouette of the lighthouse here. So we need to create some mats. We need to apply some kind of blending and see if we can kind of merge those two images in together. So if you haven't done anything with a node-based compositor before, if you've been mainly working with like effects are stacked on a layer in After Effects or something like that, the concept is not too different, except the way that you actually apply the tools. In After Effects, you're going to be stacking tools one on top of the other, and depending on the order that the stack is going to depend on how they affect the image below. Again, it's a little bit the same when you start working with nodal-based compositing as well. So initially what we want to do is create some kind of mat that we can use to composite through. Weirdly, I'm going to use a color correct on my lighthouse. So if we drag out a color correct node and we hook that into here for a second, I get my color correction tools come up, which is going to allow me then to, well, actually make a sort of a high contrast image. So this is a color image. To make it black and white, we can take the saturation maybe down to 0. And then we can manipulate either the histogram or the curves. I'm going to kind of do it on the histogram to make it a very sort of black and white image, something like this. Now, technically, what we've got here now is we've got some kind of matte that we can start to use to composite through. So the next stage is going to be getting or using our matte, this image, and the background, and composite them together. So let's move our batch effects node out of the way for a second. Let's come back down to our effects nodes, and we're going to hit C again because we're going to look for a comp node. We're going to bring our comp node up, and our comp node is pretty much the same as we had on the timeline. If we tap into this, you can see that we've got inputs, we've got matte controls, we've got blending and transparency. Also what we've got here is our inputs. Now, another way of accessing these inputs is if we hold down the Shift key and then just repeatedly keep hitting the Alt key, you can see what happens is that it starts to split out these little nodules, these little connectors that make it actually a lot easier to start hooking things up. So we know that we want our background to go into our background tab, and it's going to be this one. So if we just approach this and we can connect it up, and you can see now that we've got our background feeding into our background tab. I actually want to have this coming into my matte and this coming into my foreground. So once again, if we hold down Shift and hit Alt, we can get a front connector comes out and we can connect this up to there. And then if we hit Alt and Alt again, the first matte input is going to be basically connecting this. So now when we look at the result of what we've got, you can see that what we're using is, this is our background. So we can see our background. And this is our foreground, and we're using this color correct, or effectively as a matte, to cut through the images. Now you can see here that stuff can get quite confusing quite quickly because you're going to have lines crossing things. So sometimes you may just want to rearrange and organize your node in a slightly better way, but you're always going to have these kind of straight lines which may kind of put you off. So with our tool chest over here, whatever we have selected, we're going to have a set of tools that is relevant for this. So as we're inside a batch at the moment, the tool chest is relevant just for what we can do inside a batch. So it's doing things like mimic links, connection, add points, and draw compass, which are like backdrops. As soon as we look at some other tools, like if we were working with masks, that tool chest will then change to reflect the tools that were accessible there. So just as an example, if we brought out a G mask for a second, and we came in here and we look at our tool, we can, when we start drawing objects, we can now then start to have tools that are relative to this particular module that we're working on. So the tools chest will be constantly changing depending on which tool you have selected at a time. We're going to pick this up, we're going to throw this away, pretty much just like we do with Eclipse on the desktop as well. So one thing I can do is I can actually come through and I can go to add points, which is going to allow me to draw connectors to sort of tidy up my schematic a little bit. So once again, there's a couple of hotkeys here. You can see that M takes you to move, A takes you to add points. So, you know, if you get in the habit of learning those fairly quickly, it saves you going down to this tool chest environment. You can also, if you want to, just hold down A, click and add a connector and release, and it will take you back to the move tool. And the same that if you wanted to delete a node, you can hold down the D key, tap on something, and it will delete that. Now, once again, we want to kind of maintain a context when we're viewing this. So if we come into our contextual menu, and we're going to set as context 1, and then over here, we're going to view our result. We're going to set a context 1 there. So we're going to be always looking at our result here, regardless of what we change. Now, the reason we want to do that, because we want to manipulate some of these tools, you know. So in this respect, we're viewing the result of this all the time. But in here, once again, we double tap on this, we're going to get access to how we control the matte. So for sure, you can come into this viewport and you can hit F4 so you can see the result. And you can see now that when we start to manipulate the levels, you know, the black levels or the white levels, that is going to have an effect on what we're viewing over on the other side. So if we make this kind of quite wishy-washy, you can see it's not as a harsh cutout as we had before. We can then sort of start to blend in some of the other image as well. Escape over here will then take me back to my schematic view. Now, a couple of other things I really want to do at this stage is that, you know, maybe I want to enlarge the lighthouse. Okay, and maybe I want to reposition the boat as well. Now we could do this in action, and in a later video we're going to be doing just that, but let's look at some of the tools that we can introduce, and then once again this will give you a better understanding of how this nodal based environment works. So right at the beginning here we've got a thing called a 2D transform. So if we drag that out to here, and effectively I want to use this to manipulate my lighthouse, my sort of foreground element. So what I can do then, if I just kind of quickly separate these off for a moment, is I can take my color, I can take my matte, I can feed that into there, and then I can reconnect out my front and my matte back into my comp node. So at the moment, everything is looking exactly the same because this 2D transform is in fact at default. But once again, when I come over to the 2D transform tools and then start to manipulate this, you can see that fairly obviously that I can go through and I can start to move that around to exactly where I want. So we're manipulating not only the front, but the matte channel at the same time. And then conversely, I can kind of do the same down here. I could say, well, actually, I need to reposition the boat. I don't really like where that is. So if I bring out another 2D transform node, hold down Shift, drop that into the pipeline, and once again, in context, I can kind of look in here. I can say, well, actually, I need that to be a little bit over there. Maybe we'll kind of scale that up, move that down. So we start to get control of where these elements are living. I think at the moment that this is still all a little bit too harsh, so I need to sort of in somehow modify the matte channel coming in, because it's the matte that is actually sort of cutting through this. So to do that, I need to put another tool in the matte path here. So coming back to my effects nodes, if we look for M for matte, and we've got a load of matte tools down here, but in fact what we really want to use is a matte edge. So I'm going to be bringing this in, holding down Shift, dropping it into the pipeline there. And if we double tap on that, you can see that we get a whole bunch of tools that allow me to modify the matte. So if I turn on something like shrink, we can see now that what we can actually do is we can start to like erode or shrink in that matte. And once again, if we look at the results in this view, and while I'm manipulating the slider, you can see actually what I'm doing is I'm changing the way that the matte kind of interacts. So if we get something like this, maybe we turn on a little bit of blur and we kind of blur that image up as well. Effectively now we're using a blurred matte as the object which we're going to be cutting through and using to cut out our lighthouse and our boat there as well. So finally on this, if we come to our comp node, and down here as well, we can change obviously things like how this kind of blends in. So we can change the multiplication or averaging, or kind of whatever you want. We're going to leave it at blend, but then we also have control over the inputs and the matte inputs as well. So actually what we could do here is we could play around with the transparency of either. So I could actually just sort of take down the transparency of the boat a little bit, so you get a bit more of that coming through, or take down the transparency of the lighthouse. We can kind of just mix and match it as we see fit, or even animate it. So everything that you've got inside of Batch is animatable. We can auto key things, and when we do that, actually we're going to do that just now. So if we say over the course of time, what we actually want is it to go from something like this. So we're going to kind of set a keyframe there, and by about halfway through the shot, we're just going to kind of bring in sort of a suggestion of that boat. And you can see what we've got now is an animation where that kind of comes in over time, and then we'll hold for the rest of the shot. So I'm kind of happy with what I've done there. This is kind of an effect that I wanted. It's a graphical effect that's going to kind of fit in. I'm going to take the result of my comp node and I'm going to hook it back up to my batch output. And from there, all I really need to do is exit from this view. So if I exit the batch effect, that is going to take me back onto the timeline. Now you can see here what's happened is it's actually collapsed both of those layers. We originally had two. We've actually kind of containerized it inside this batch effect, but you can see pretty soon that we get the result of what we've just done coming in. And if we're not happy, once again, we can select that clip, go back in to the editor and manipulate this and add things and take stuff out to our heart's content. Now at some point, you may add so much effects that you won't get a real-time playback on here. So we're going to have to look at possibly at some point in rendering, which is where, when we're talking before about our caching system with the media folder, this is where the render is going to be going into. Now we haven't actually done any rendering up to this point, but when you start using things like batch effects, at some point you're probably going to have to start processing. So at the moment, this clip is technically unprocessed, but what we can do on a selection basis, so we can have more than one clip selected, but we're just going to do this one at the moment, is we're going to render that selected clip. And you'll get a quick little progress bar comes up. It'll process the clip. The bar will turn black, so white is a clue that this is an unprocessed clip. Doesn't mean that it won't play back in real time. It just means that at the moment it's not processed. We're actually using all the power of the HP and the NVIDIA graphics to get that real-time feedback. But at some point you may hit it where it actually kind of stutters. So now we know that this clip, even with its effects on, are always going to play back in real time regardless of what we're doing. So that example is kind of using two clips that already exist on the timeline. But the flexibility of batch effects is really quite useful. You don't have to have all the media in the timeline that you want to start off with. You can actually use the workspace panel as a repository for media that you actually want to bring into your composite. So there's a couple of things that I always look for in a system when I'm playing around with stuff. I look for compositing, the editing, I look for things like keying and tracking. And the tracking we're going to tackle in the next video when we look at action, because that's pretty much where you want to do most of your tracking. But the keying we can look at here. So what we've got in this particular case is that we have a woman. So this is from HollywoodCameraWork.com. I'm going to leave you a link at that at the end of the video as well. They do lots of great stock footage to practice tracking on, to practice green screen keying. It's all Creative Commons, so you can download, play with it, do what you want. So this is a good example to see how we can do some keying and actually bring in some material after the event. So I know I want to do some keying. I could do the keying in the timeline layers, but once again, I'm going to go in with a batch effect on this. You can see because I'm only taking a single object, we don't have any options ticked. But what I do want to do is I want to composite this against obviously a background. So over here, what I've done is I've had a quick browse around in Google Images, and I've found loads of beach scenes. Now, this is my workspace panel. These are actually living on my desktop at the moment, but there's nothing to stop me from actually just bringing them in and dropping them into my batch environment. I can kind of go through and select those and manipulate them around as I want to. Now, once again, just temporarily, we're just going to hide the workspace panel to give me a little bit more space. And we're going to look at how we can approach some keying and then swapping in some backgrounds as well. So once again, split up to two viewports, and we're just going to go back and reframe that for a moment. We're going to separate that out and kind of zoom in a little bit here. So this is what we've got to key, and then we can actually put this against any kind of background that we really want to. So Flame has an abundance of keyers built in. If we actually go to the key tab, these are all the keying tools that you can work with. We've got Luma keyers, keyer channels, RGB keys, YUV, HLS, 3D keys, a whole bunch of keys. The chances of you having to use a third-party keyer are fairly slim. But a good one just to get started with, which is really easy to use, is a thing called the master keyer. So if we just hit M for master keyer, now we're going to drag this out here for a second. The master keyer also has multiple inputs. It has a front, a background, and a matte. And I know this is kind of crazy, but to start off with, what we need to do is actually populate all of those. We can actually composite inside the master keyer node, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to use the master keyer node to help me generate a matte. So once again, we're going to connect this to the front, in this case also to the background, and also to the matte channel. When we make that final connection, you can see now that what we've actually got is our front view inside of here for us to start selecting some green, as it were, I guess. Double tap on the master keyer, and it's refreshingly not that daunting. So like all keyers, the first thing we really want to do is sample some colors. So we've got two pots here. We're just going to sample a bit of a color there and a bit of a color there, and you can see that these are two different colors, and we can kind of mix between that key color. But we're not really seeing a matte at the moment. Now, to actually see the matte, we need to go into our matte view. So if we go through F4, you can see that this is showing my out matte. This will be the matte that is coming out of the blue output. And this gives me a much better idea of how successful my key has been at the moment. And you can see, well, not that successful. And to be honest, because we downloaded this media is quite compressed, so we are going to get some artifacts. But initially, just from two samples, you know, that's not too bad. But we can quickly refine and make that key an awful lot better by using some of the tools inside. So while we're still sampling our map for a second, if we go in and hover and hold the Alt key down, you're going to see all of these kind of little heads up displays coming here. And this allows us to interactively alter the matte according to the darkness and the lightness as we go through. So if we go over an area which we want to modify, so this is all kind of like a little bit grey down here, we can actually just grab that and start to slide and manipulate the matte overall. Now you can see that this is also affecting the woman here. It's affecting the white area. But depending on when you go in the image, it will be pixel specific. So you're going to get more or less sliders depending on where you are in the image. You can see even by that, we've started to clean up the matte quite nicely. If we zoom in, we can also see that we can do exactly the same process over the white areas. So we can go through here, and what you'll find is, as you work down, the adjustments will be kind of a little bit more subtle, a little bit more coarse, depending on where you are. Don't worry overly too much about all the matte shadows, range A, range C. Just wiggle them around. No, that's not a technical term, until you start to refine your matte quite nicely. But generally, the top's going to be the most coarse, and then working down will be working in slightly different ranges. Now you will get to a point of diminishing returns with your matte where you affect one thing and it affects something else over here. So in the tools inside the master key, we can also go through and apply different operations. So one thing that's kind of quite nice here as well is that if you have got particularly noisy footage or grainy footage, we can go up to our degrain tool, we can sample, and that will actually do a degrain process just on the key channel. So it will kind of knock out some of that noise. You can see here by activating it and deactivating it that it kind of just smooths off some of those matte channels. Coming back to our selection tool here, we've got 3 patches, and patches are really useful. They allow you to do kind of like a sub key on an area. So the way that this works is that if we select a patch and then we hold down Control and we draw a box over an area that we would like to be black, it will effectively go through and make that area black. It's going to do another key. And you see here, we can just sort of very gently just sort of start going through and picking those black areas until we get nothing at all. And the nice thing about this is that by and large, unless you go completely mad, it doesn't actually do anything to the white area or significantly to the white area, because we're not kind of eroding the matte or anything. We're actually doing another key on top. If we select another patch, if you had holes in the white area of the matte, we could go through, we could do a similar process here where you can see that we can just go and pick up some of that area, and then we can start to actually make that kind of quite solid. And you do have controls, you can turn these on and off as you want in case you think you've overcooked it, and you can also kind of play around with the range, with the softness for both, and also kind of like the range that it kind of affects. So it's pretty flexible, and once again, Control Tap will reset it. So now we've got, apart from this stuff around the edge, we've got a fairly kind of like nice matte that we want to work with. Now, like I said, we could composite this directly in the master key, but what we're going to do is we're going to just pass the matte channel on, because we've got some tools that are going to help us refine the matte a little bit better downstream. One nice thing that you do have inside of here is that we have multiple outputs from the master key. So by default, it's going to output the result, but we could actually output an automatically color corrected front of that image. So whenever we start to select a color to key, the master key, one of the nice things about it is that we'll do an automatic spill suppression based on that. We could put in a channel booleans or a spill suppressor later on, but you know what, this does such a nice job straight off that it's probably a good idea to select your front color corrected out. So now what we need to do is can kind of composite these two things together, one of our backgrounds. Now what you're going to see here is that these are all different sizes. We've got some really big ones, we've got some 1920, 1080s, and if we bring out a straightforward comp node here for a second, and we bring this into my front input, and we're going to bring our matte into here. If we bring in something that is not the same resolution as this, we'll kind of get an error on here. So what the comp node can't do is it can't resize images to match. So we're not going to use that, but what we will do is we're going to be using an action node. Now, as I said, we're not going to get too much into action at the moment, but the good thing about action is that it's a multi-resolution compositor. We can feed images in here of whatever different size we want, and we can resize and position them as we want. At the moment, it's taking in the default resolution of the clip that we went into. And to start off with, we're just going to add a couple of inputs. So I'm going to hit Control N, and this is going to be bringing in an input, and from that I'm going to say, well, I'm going to bring in my tropical beach, and that's going to kind of populate inside of the action environment. I'm going to hit Control N again to bring out another input. I'm going to bring in my color corrected front into here, and I'm also going to bring my matte into here as well to composite the two images together. And you can see straight away that, you know what, this is actually not too bad. We've still got to do a garbage mask to get rid of the fan, and also this little bit of hole in the matte up here, but by and large we've got some nice transparency working for us. If we just go into the action node for a second, into the schematic, you can see that here we still have a lot of control over the actual sizing of those plates. So, you know, this plate is actually a lot bigger there, so we can squiggle it around, move it like this, and then we can select the axes. Don't worry, we'll be covering this in a later video, where we can go through, and actually for this one, I'm just going to kind of reposition the fan and the hole out of shot. But by and large, that's kind of looking pretty good. Now you're going to see that we've still got some kind of like edge issues here as well, and maybe want to put some light wrap in or something like that at some later stage. But like I said, we're going to keep this nice and light, so we're just going to focus on some of the tools that exist inside of here. So now if we look at refining the edge of that matte slightly, we're not going to use a matte tool, a matte edge tool. We're actually going to use a little tool down here called a pixel spread. So if we bring pixel spread out, now what pixel spread does is kind of very clever. Most times when you're working with a key or a matte and you start getting edges, the temptation is to sort of manipulate or erode the matte or blur the matte to sort of solve that problem. Now what pixel spread is, it goes in the opposite direction. It actually takes the matte and the front, and it will use the matte to kind of expand the front image to fill the matte. So it's probably a bit easier to show than it is to talk about. What we're going to do here is we're going to take our output from our master key and we're going to feed that into the input. And we're going to take our matte channel and we're going to feed it into the pixel spread here. And we're going to look at pixel spread for a moment, kind of quite close up. Now, once again, we're going to use our F1 and F4 keys. So front, which is our original, and F4 as result. And if you look really closely, in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to overcook the pixel spread for a minute. I'm really going to sort of grow out the parallax. You can see that the original is here, but by using the matte channel, using this, what pixel spread is going to do is it's going to grow pixels to start filling that in. So we're not affecting the matte, but we are growing pixels that will then be cut out by the matte afterwards. So if we just kind of reset this back to default, it defaults as 1 pixel. And now what we're going to do is we're going to take the output of both of these and feed them into my action. So I'm going to take the front out of pixel spread and the matte, because the front is going to be expanded. And once again, if we go down to here and we set a context of my action, and we set our viewing context there as well. Oops, daisy, not that one. We want to actually be into that one for a second. So what we can do now is we can go through, and in context, we can start to manipulate the edges and the width of my parallax spread. So you can see here that we've got just a little bit of white. We could probably come through, we can just kind of fill and just smooth that out. So we get a much nicer result that kind of blends through. Now you may say that we still possibly got some issues. Maybe the spill suppression is not that great. So what's good about this is that we can then also backtrack to the master key, and once again in context we can use some tools down here to blend and work on the spill suppression as well. So if we work on the blend, basically the edges, and we kind of zoom in on this context view, even though we're looking at the result in the action, we still can go through and we can still see things like our tools that are relevant for the master key. So like our blend loom and our blend edge size. And once again, by manipulating these, we can actually affect sort of like the blend and the edge size of what we're working with in the context of our background that we're working with inside of action. So that's a nice way of working. But the same is also true for spill suppression. So maybe it's just a little bit overcooked for the spill suppression. Maybe we want to kind of go back in, and once again we can get those contextual tools back up, and we can go through and we can start to adjust the spill hue and also the tweak on there to actually get a much nicer image. You could also do this with a color correction in the pipeline as well coming down. But hopefully you kind of get the idea of working sort of procedurally. We can insert tools and operators and different effects in here to basically make your image look really nice. And once again, this is really an easy way to swap out footage. Okay, we could bring in multiple layers, but maybe we want to see, I'm not sure about this, maybe we want to actually change the background. So we could actually just repipe this in, come back into our schematic here, and then once again sort of manipulate the scale and size of our background to see how that works. When we're kind of happy with the result of that, again, we just need to make sure that this is hooked up to our batch effect output, which is going to take me back to our timeline. Exit batch effects, and you can see that our composite is put together on the background. And just to make sure that this plays back real time, we'll just do a quick render. You shouldn't really have to. And you're going to see now, actually we're going to go through, if we tap on these playback controls, we can actually set it to a loop and the current selection. So it's going to be this one. And then we can see a little bit of a pre-roll, post-roll, and there we have our composite through. So a few little added bonuses there. We can control the way that we play back sections. But hopefully you get the idea, the creativity, the flexibility that you have working in this batch environment. As I said, these are a couple of really basic examples. To do all the tools inside a batch would probably take days. And there's a couple of videos out on the internet that show you how to work with specific tools. But you've got the basics of what you need to do to start bolting things together. You know about the nodes, you know how to get nodes in, you know how to connect, what the colors mean, front, back, matte, and result, and some of the hotkeys. You've got an idea of how you can start making mattes and how you can start doing some keying, and that's always a good place. And pretty much as you work through some of the other tools, it will become quite obvious. It's just kind of getting these groundings and these foundations. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope it makes a little bit more sense. The next video we're going to be doing is going to be pretty much focusing on action and all the things that we can do inside of there. So go away, have a practice. Hope you've enjoyed it. I've had fun going through all this again. And we will see you soon.